The assistant pastor where I attend church was preaching a few weeks prior to this, and he brought up a verse I had heard before, but he presented it in a different way. What I had always heard was, "Verily I say unto you, whatsoever ye shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever ye shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Matthew 18:18. That's the KJV version. And this reminded me of, "And I will give unto thee the kings of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." And that's Matthew 16:19, also in the KJV, which is what I grew up with. What he pointed out was the Amplified translation, which is not the same wording. In the Amplified it reads, "I assure you and most solemnly say to you, whatever you bind, forbid, declare to be improper and unlawful on earth, shall have already been bound in heaven. And whatever you loose, permit, or declare lawful on earth, shall have already been loosed in heaven." Likewise, in 16:19 it says, "I will give you the keys and authority of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind, forbid, or declare to be improper and unlawful on earth will have already been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose, permit, declare lawful on earth will have already been loosed in heaven." Now, this gives us two very different forms of thought that form from these. The KJV and 23 of the other 25 translations I was able to get a hold of all make it seem as though we decide what we decide will be decided in heaven. It places the power of the final decision in our hands. And we see this coming out today in the progressive Christianity teachings, the LGBTQI churches. Better put that in quote because, well, we'll get into that later. And a few teachings that that have crept into some of the individual churches. I was recently looking for something on Google, the name of a church and all we could remember about it was the state location, and that's where I found out about the LGBTQI churches and the churches that are accepting homosexuality in their membership, which is not scriptural at all. After all, according to them, whatever we decide is acceptable is acceptable. Whatever we say, God's going to have to conform to it. And it says so in all those translations of the Bible. And yes, those verses are about our governance of what is correct and incorrect in the church, but they do not actually give us the power to decide what is good and what is wrong. Instead, these verses give us the authority to enforce what has already been decided and declared in the Bible. Remember, 23 of the 25 versions I got a hold of all read that way. But the Amplified did not, and when I looked it up, the Young's literal translation did not. And I like how Young's and Amplified take into account the tense and sentence structure prior to the translation here. The wording is not correct in the vast majority of those translations. The actual thought behind these verses is that what we decide as a church is to have already been decided as proper and improper in heaven. What God says we are to decide is what we are to decide, and He's already put it out there in the Bible for us to see. And we see this. Many churches teach about the 10 Commandments. And there are many more than just 10, though. There are rules about how to govern ourselves to those who are around us, rules of how to worship, rules about cleanliness. And I learned all this from a guest speaker who had studied this really in depth. And he pointed out there were over 600 laws given in the Old Testament, not just 10. Have some of these changed? Well, salvation has, baptism has, and the Lord's Supper has. And Galatians 3:24 points out that the law, these 600 plus laws, were a guardian, although the KJV calls it a schoolmaster, that was to lead us to Christ, who would then justify us through His faith. Hebrews 10:14 says, "For by one offering He hath perfected to the end those sanctified," and that is the Young's literal translation. Under the law, there were many different sacrifices that had to be repeated over and over and over. But under Christ's sacrifice, there is one that will perfect to the end. And that's very important to show. It is not something that we can lose. Once you're saved, you are saved because it says He will perfect us to the end, not until you screw up again. Baptism and the Lord's Supper are shown to us in the Gospels. Jesus modeled them for us, and in his immersion and raising for the baptism and prayer, breaking of unleavened bread, and drinking the fruit of the vine, not our wine. Their wine was completely different from ours. You can check out history of the drink for that one. For the Lord's Supper. And we are to keep them the way he did.